bow down.
Okay, if we now want to turn to today's message in the book of Acts. We are in the book of Acts chapter 12 today. We finished up chapter 11 last week. And so this week we get a chance to see into the book of Acts and find out that things did not stay as nice as they had been. Remember, everything was going fairly well in Jerusalem after Jesus rose and ascended, and the apostles went out and they began having a major impact among the people, and the Sanhedrin brought them in, warned them. The Sanhedrin was upset that they were proclaiming Jesus as Messiah because the Sanhedrin had said this guy's not Messiah and they'd killed him. So the Sanhedrin was upset, and they said, don't preach in his name anymore. And they did everything extremely legally. We've talked about that throughout the entire thing. Even though the thing that happened with Stephen looks like mob rule, it's very clear, even as they say, Saul was standing there guarding the cloaks of the witnesses, they were doing everything in a legally prescribed manner. And as Luke summarized what happened, it makes it sound like it was a little bit more abrupt than probably it was. A vote had to be taken, and all sorts of things had to go on. But anyway, with the jumping back to the disciples, the Sanhedrin said, don't preach in his name, and then they sent them away with a warning. The next time they arrested them, they said, you violated the law, because now they had made it a law that you don't preach in his name, and so they got a flogging out of it. But pretty much there was there was an uneasy understanding that this is okay, that we can get along together right now. They're uncomfortable with the idea that you're saying it was Jesus, but we can get along. They were just basically another sect of Judaism. And then Stephen shows up, and he's a Hellenistic Jew. He's from the diaspora countries who is now living in Jerusalem, Greek speaking. And his whole perspective, well, if you grew up in Jerusalem and if you grew up in Judea, your perspective was temple-centered. You lived out around the Roman Empire somewhere, you didn't have a temple-centered perspective. You had a synagogue-centered perspective. You had an understanding that God's grace was through the local community, not just the temple. And so Stephen, when he gets up and starts debating the local people in Jerusalem, he begins to talk about God's grace coming to people and that we're the temple of God, and that got him in big trouble because now that felt like a major step away from what was supposed to be going on in Jerusalem. And the persecution that broke out after Stephen was one that was aimed at the Greek-speaking Jews from the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people around the Roman Empire. Now, that persecution against them pretty much ended when Saul was converted. And the time frame we're going to get into in a few minutes is just about 10 years after. There's been about 10 years of not an uneasy getting along. The Greek-speaking Jews had all fled Jerusalem. It was just the Jewish Christians who were there, and they still were involved in the temple worship. They were involved in everything. They were completely involved in the ceremonies and everything that was going on. And so it was like this détente, this uneasy alliance that was going on between the Jewish people and the church at that particular time. And then, as I said last time, when Peter went to Cornelius, and all of a sudden Gentiles were allowed to come into the church without coming through the synagogue. That was a major shift. In fact, there's a lot of people that believe we start to see the shift from the apostles leading the church to the elders leading the church, and that becomes very clear in Acts chapter 15 that James, as an elder, not James the apostle, James the brother of Jesus, who was never a disciple until after Jesus rose again, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes the leading elder in Jerusalem. And that may have happened because the apostles were starting to be viewed as people who were too busy upsetting the apple cart. Even though it was from God, it still takes a while for the gears to change, for the people, their mindsets to get around it. And besides that, the apostles were out running around, and then as we see today, they were getting persecuted at a very specific level. So we will get into that. That's where we're at today. There has been we've been told about Cornelius. We've been told about the things that God is doing. We are told that Barnabas went to Tarsus and got Saul to be involved there. All of that is what we have kind of as a precursor. And now Luke just wants to go back and say, now, by the way, let me tell you what's been going on, because there's a new king on the throne. His name is Herod Agrippa. And this new king was in charge of everything. He was much like Herod the Great. After Herod the Great, the empire had been split into different parts. It was a tetrarchy. So you could, some people were in charge of 2 pieces of it. Sometimes it was, just little sections. But after Pontius Pilate and some other procurators, they decided once again that a king was going to be okay. Because Herod Agrippa grew up in Rome. And he grew up and was friends with Caligula. He was friends with Claudius. These guys all became emperors. And he got a lot of favor through them. He also was under, I think it was Tiberius, thrown in prison. But, sometimes when you're close to someone, they know just what a rascal you are. But then as soon as he died, they got him out of prison, and they actually made him a king and gave him part of some tetrarchies. And then finally, they gave him the entire thing. So he was the king in the sense of Herod the Great of all of that area, all the tetrarchies of Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, all of those areas. He was now king, 41 AD. And he was Idumean, which means he wasn't a Jewish king. But he was very good at letting them know that he was sad about that. He could cry crocodile tears on a dime. He was good at currying Jewish favor. That's what he did. His job description, he knew if he kept the people happy, they wouldn't rebel against him, he would be in easy street. And so that's what he did. He did everything he could to curry favor with the Jewish people. I mean, he would lead the processions on the holy days just like he was supposed to, and he'd read the parts of the readings for the day that he was supposed to read as the king. And then when it says, and don't let a ruler rule over you who's not Jewish, he'd actually weep. He was good. He didn't resign his position, but he'd at least weep over it. They loved him. Okay, the Jewish people loved him because he did everything for them. By the way, before he came over Jerusalem, he's the one that talked Caligula out of not putting Caligula's statue in the middle of the temple. Caligula was about to put a statue in the temple of himself that people would have to worship instead of the true God, and this guy's the one that talked him out of it. Everyone knew about that. And so, he had a lot of favor with the Jewish people, but he knew that he needed to keep currying that favor, and so that's where we pick up in Acts chapter 12 today, as we find out how he chose to curry that favor. And the theme I've picked today, because of the fact that things look pretty dire for Peter in this particular section of Scripture, is that there is always hope for rescue. There's always hope for rescue. Never give up. Never assume that there's no hope for rescue. We've talked about my mom today. We've said it looks like the Lord's transitioning her home. However, I'm also have told the Lord very clearly, but if you want to intervene and do what you did back in 1990, feel free. Remember what he did back in 1990? She had 10 days to live, and by the time we got up to see her, it was 7 or 6 days to live. All the blood markers kept on saying, and they were very good with leukemia, especially this type, tracking how long a person had to live. And at that point in time, God reached in and delivered her. That was 1990. What year is it again today? Oh, yeah, it's 2020. I mean, she got an extra 30 years out of life. And so you never give up. You never assume. And this whole thing of I've prayed to the Lord about this thing. I said, but Lord, I know you're good at this. You can rescue at the last moment. So I'm open either way. Okay, but as I told you earlier, I want to make sure that I don't step on Mom's will either. So anyway, so it's about 41. Herod has just come into authority. He's doing some naughty things, currying favor. Basically, this two-faced guy. When he was in Rome, he lived just like a Roman, but when he was around the Jewish people, he lived like a fastidious Jew. I mean, he looked like, he was like one of the most, in Rome, he'd be eating bacon. When he gets back to the Jewish people, he's, no, none of that for me, because he was fastidious in his observances of the Jewish law, because he wanted to continue to curry that favor, which is why they loved him so much. So, anyway, today, there's always hope for rescue. Herod, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12. At that time, King Herod laid hands on certain individuals from the church in order to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, executed with a sword. That's pretty harsh. How do you curry favor? Well, just kill an apostle. Okay, remember the context. Gentiles are becoming Christians. It's very clear that in Peter's opinion later on that the Jewish people were happy with what, and Luke says the same thing, that the Jewish people were happy that these apostles are being taken care of. And when the apostles shifted from being temple-centric and Mosaic code-centric, they started to lose favor big time with the Jewish people. Because now they were a threat. This was no longer just a sect of Judaism, this Christianity thing. There were a group of people that were connected to Judaism yet, but it was obvious it was now going to also start to spread throughout the empire, and it was not Jewish in nature at all. Christians were now no longer going to be connected to the temple or the synagogue, and that was a major threat to everyone. It was one of those moments in history when things were shifting and changing, and when people see things shifting and changing, they often react against it. So, there was a problem. And suddenly the apostles didn't have favor. Herod understood. Remember, he was going to, by the way, he was the grandson of Herod the Great, but he was going to make sure that everyone knew he was zealous for the law. And so he began to persecute these people that thought the Gentiles were okay and who were bringing them into their faith group. And he began to persecute some people in the church. Herod was a political animal from the bottom up. And he knew exactly how to gain favor and support. He became more zealous than anyone else there. And so he moved against the apostles. And the first apostle he grabbed was James, the brother of John, one of the sons of Zebedee. Remember, they were the ones that said, "Lord, can we sit on your right hand?" They used their mom to get to Jesus. They said, "Can we sit at your right hand?" And Jesus said, I can't do that, but can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And they said yes, and James proved he could. Okay, the cup was the cup of death for him. John, it turned out, his was the cup of perseverance, because John lived and lived. John may still be alive today for all we know. But he lived the longest. We know for sure he was still alive somewhere around the 90s. At a certain point he got so large that he had to be carried around. And old. He had to be carried around, and he would get up, and his basic message was, "Children, love one another." My children love one another. Basically, the message of 1 John. But he lost his brother right here, 41 A.D. Less than a decade after Jesus had been crucified. James was killed by Herod, and he was executed with the sword, which means more than likely a king like Herod, following the rule of law, would have charged him with treason of some sort against the country, against him, and then the punishment would have been beheading. Remember, Herod wasn't Rome. Rome would have crucified him. But Herod wasn't Rome, and so they beheaded James with a sword. Okay? And then, that had to be a shock, by the way. Can you imagine in the church? People would have thought the apostles by this time were invincible, wouldn't you think? And yet, they lost James. It had to be a shock to their system. It had to be an amazingly difficult thing for them to be able to handle. I can imagine they were going, "God, your thoughts are not our thoughts," because I think I would have thought that you would have protected James. I could see Jesus on his throne going, "Yeah, you guys remember I gave you the authority?" Remember, we've been given the authority. We can be upset about things that God is doing, except that if we're not using the authority he gave us to stop it, you can't accuse God of things that we're being negligent over. So anyway, this is verses 3 and 4. When Herod saw that it pleased the Jews, he also proceeded to arrest Peter. This was during the days of unleavened bread. After he had arrested him, he put him in prison with 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. He planned to bring him out to the people after Passover. So it was Passover, the time of unleavened bread. The season of unleavened bread was 7 days, starting with the Passover meal. And they were, at this point in time, in the Passover. For whatever reason, he stumbled across Peter, whatever, he found him. And so he brings them. He thought, well, I've got Peter now. I can get more favor with the Jewish people. And the thing that he didn't count on is because he wasn't going to move against Peter during this high holiday. It just wasn't going to do it. Remember, he was a fastidious Jew, or attempting to be a fastidious Jew because he was an Idumean. But he would not do something that would violate the sensibilities of the Jewish people. So he said, we'll do this after Passover. And what it was the Lord giving the church a chance to respond to all of this thing. And so he had to, what am I going to do with this guy? So it gave the people a chance to pray. And so he had Peter and didn't want to execute him during the Passover. The people wouldn't come. They were celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover and that whole festival season. And so now he was going to bring him out. It was going to be a big show day as he executed Peter. And then he puts him under an amazing amount of security. It says that he put him in prison with 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. And that that means that it's probably talking about the night watch. He may have been in the Fortress Antonia. He could have been in Herod's personal area. There were places to hold people in both of them. We do know that Fortress Antonia did have, you could take an exit into the temple area if they had to rush in there, but there was also an exit into the streets, and that comes up later on in this story. But obviously it could have also been in Herod's palace quarters where he had a holding cell also and ended up on a street, as we see what happens later with Peter. Anyway, the squads were probably set up every 3 hours for the night watches. Night watches were 3 hours, and so there were 4 night watches, and so probably 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 3 hours on, 3 hours on. Then they were done with the night watch. The next squad got up and watched over him. So this, by the way, the security demonstrates that Peter was a big prize, but it also demonstrates something else. The last time we put this guy in prison, he got out. We put him and the apostles in our prison, and they were suddenly preaching in the temple courts. And so Herod's like, okay, these guys are slippery. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen. They had a lot of support in Jerusalem. And so someone could try to do a jailbreak, sneak him out, whatever. And so he made sure that wasn't going to happen. Verse 5, therefore, because Peter was being kept in the prison, the church was praying earnestly to God on his behalf. Hey, the church had time. And they also understood his life was really under threat. If they had taken what happened to James lightly, and there's no evidence that they did, but it may have happened so quickly that they could not respond appropriately as quickly as they needed to, they learned a lesson. And now they had time. And the time that they had was, they knew they had the Passover time, so they got together and they began to pray. They could gather to pray, so they did gather to pray. Now, James, the head elder of the church, later on wrote one of the books of the Bible. And in this particular book of the Bible, in James 5:16b, he wrote, the divinely energized prayer of the righteous person is very powerful. Now, I'm translating the Greek word which is translated elsewhere as energy, divine energy, the work of God. It's a word which refers to supernatural energy. When I'm talking about spiritual gifts, it talks about, the Holy Spirit gives the gifts, the Son gives the ministry opportunities, and the Father supplies the divine energy. That's from 1 Corinthians 12. If you ever heard me teach on spiritual gifts, this is the same word group, or word with just different. This is more of an adjectival form. But anyway, it's talking about a release of divine energy, and so that's what James is talking about. It's the divinely energized prayer of a righteous person, and it's when the Lord is just listening and there's something that connects and the energy is released and something happens. The divinely energized prayer of the righteous person is very powerful. James may have been thinking about this particular event that Peter was prayed for by the church. Okay, verses 6 and 7. On the night before Herod was going to bring him before the people, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, where he was bound with 2 chains, and guards were at the door watching over the prison. Suddenly an angel of the Lord drew near, and a light shone in the room. He struck Peter's side, woke him, and said, "Get up quickly!" Then the chains fell off his hands. Okay, this was, well, I'd say the last moment of the last time that he could be involved. We're talking about, this is the last watch of the night before Peter's going to be taken out before the crowds. And Herod wasn't going to have a long trial. If he didn't try him and execute him the same day, that would have been a surprise. He may have tried him and executed him the next day, but Peter's days on this earth were pretty short. So it's the night before Peter was about to lose his life, or at least be condemned to death. And here's the thing. This is why the message title is, it's never too late to be rescued. I mean, the thing, the fact that we as God's people can always persist in going after God and never giving up hope. When my dad was dying in 2006, I would call up to my brothers and sisters. I wasn't up there yet, but even I didn't get up there until the very last moments of my dad's life. But during the time, we had been told actually he was going to live for, he had at least 2-3 months or 5-6 months, whatever it was. And all of a sudden he took a turn for the worse. And they began saying, "Oh, he doesn't have long." And then everyone got involved. And I began telling my brothers and sisters, really, really working the phone to say, "Come on, don't give up hope. We got to keep praying because God can rescue up to the very end." We saw it happen with Mom. I had evidence. Okay, 1990, I had evidence. And so I was able to say, remember what happened with Mom. She got miraculously healed at the last moment when they had given her only 10 days to live. And when the report went out to hospitals that were consulting, they said, "Wait a minute, she stopped dying." The hospitals that were consulting said, "No, that's a mistake. It's impossible." That's how miraculous it was. They said, "Sorry, their test must be wrong. It's false hope. She cannot be in remission." And she was in more than remission. She was healed. Took 5 years before they admitted that, but now she's been alive 30 years. I mean, and I would call them and I would say, "Listen, look what the Lord did for our mother. Now let's pray that he does the same thing for my dad." And my dad was failing. And I would say, and then the pastor that they have in their church showed up, and I had to be very, very calm. Because he showed up to pray with them and basically consigned him to death. Because he had no faith for healing. I mean, he didn't know about Mom's healing. He didn't know anything. It's not a church that understands anything about God's intervention in the world of human beings. And so after that happened, my brothers and sisters says, the pastor came, and I said, "Get that vampire away from your minds." I was a little upset. Because I was going, it's hard to have faith for an intervention from God if you are absolutely being told by everyone, and then your spiritual leaders, all hope is lost. And I was like, I don't speak against other spiritual leaders, but I was mad at this guy. But I knew where he was coming from. I was trained in the same denomination he was. He just was doing what he knew how to do. So I didn't really call him a vampire. I wasn't very nice, but I was, careful. And so so anyway, I was just doing this thing, and I was saying, "Come on, because God, there can be hope. We can have hope." And so what happens? I arrived, and I literally arrived at about 1 a.m, and got to the house, and about 2 hours later, my dad died. But I got to the house before he died, and that was unexpected. None of us expected him to go that quickly. But up to the very end, we were praying that that Lord would intervene, that there'd be a last-minute rescue. We saw it with my mom. We had evidence of it, and so we weren't praying with any level of presumption. We were praying based upon experience. And if you've seen something like that, where in the last minute the Lord reaches in and saves the life, and gave her, back then, when my dad died in 2006, so, had given my mom already 16 years over and above what she should have had, that would have, to us, it was just like, he did it once, why can't he do it again? And so, but at the same time, we recognized when he passed away that, okay, we don't understand everything, but we want to make sure that we're pressing in. And whenever any of anyone in this congregation, or you have relatives or friends or anything, we never give up hope. We pray until the person passes. And then some people, even then, are saying, well, there were these resurrection things in the Bible, and Mark 16 says that God's people are going to be able to do resurrections on occasion. And so some people will go even further than that then. They're like, well, we missed the intervention part at this point, but let's try again. And that's just faith. And if it doesn't work, it's okay. It was faith. I can hear the Lord cheering them on. Oh, good. I'm glad you got faith. Didn't work, And it might not work because the person in heaven is looking at the Lord saying, no way. I mean, you do understand. I just want to let you know, heaven is a lot better than here. You understand this? And one of our big concerns is our loved ones here. And yet, when you get to heaven, the Lord says, I got your loved ones covered. Oh, okay. Okay. You'd have to really, really, really talk them into being desperate enough to come back. Now, if someone's call is cut off way too soon, yeah, the Lord may send them back. Who knows? We don't know Tabitha, Dorcas, who Peter called back. We never know if she yelled at him or not. By the way, Lazarus did not yell at Jesus. But remember, they were going to kill Lazarus too after Jesus raised him from the dead. So Lazarus is going, great, I died once from a sickness. Now they want to kill me. So anyway, the night before Herod's grand display, the church is saying, Lord, they're praying. It's an all-nighter. They're praying, and they're really going after this for Peter. They want to do something so that Peter doesn't get killed. Now, here we get this picture of him. He's bound. He's chained to the soldiers on either side. And don't imagine that they were sleeping. Those soldiers for that 3-hour watch, you did not sleep. If they wanted soldiers to sleep, they wouldn't have changed the guard every 3 hours. These soldiers were alert. The angels showed up, and something happened to them. Maybe they shook and became like dead men, like the guys at the tomb of Jesus. Who knows? But he's chained between two soldiers. The angel has to hit him on the side. And he wakes up, and he said, get up quickly. And just to emphasize things, the chains fall off his hand. That's just Peter being awakened in his jail cell. The angel's bringing a light along because he's probably glowing all by himself. And the chains fall off. And he doesn't know it's real. That becomes very clear. He doesn't know it's real. He thinks he's having a vision. If you think you're having a vision and the angel says, get up, what do? You don't get up. It's a vision. You're like, now what's going to happen next? And the angel's going, get up, because we have to get out of here. So the angel of the Lord arrives to be able to help him. And it's a good thing. So an angel of the Lord arrives. And then the angel said to him, arrange your clothing and put on your sandals. Peter did just this. The angel said to him, wrap your outer garment around yourself and follow me. Angels get him step by step, right? He followed him out of the cell, but he did not know if what the angel was doing was truly happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. He still didn't get it. The angel has to say to him, get up. Now, by the way, literally the angel says, gird your loins. And that's not something that translates well into English, because we don't gird our loins. We put our pants on or something. He was, the way they girded themselves was not how they slept, because it'd be really uncomfortable. They took cloth and they wrapped it up a little bit more tightly and they wound it around between their legs and their waist. And if you try sleeping like that, you're not going to be very comfortable. So they would rearrange it and basically put it around their waist to sleep at night. And then, so in the middle of the night, he's got his clothing arranged in the sleep fashion. Some people have translated this, put on your belt. That still doesn't translate. Arrange your clothing is as close as I could get. I could say gird your loins, but you're going, So he's basically saying, hey, get yourself decent. And then he has to tell him, after he says, get your clothing, your sandals on. By the way, we're going outside, put your cloak on. They usually slept on their cloak. So get your outer garment and put it on. And so he does that. He puts his outer garment on and is able to, against the chill, of course. I mean, this is early in the morning. Passover time. This is springtime. So it's chilly. Remember when Jesus was arrested during Passover, they had charcoal fires in the courtyards. It was not a balmy time of year. And so wrap yourself against the chill. We're going. And Peter still didn't know what was going on. He was used to visions. Remember the vision, the canopy coming down, or something like a sail coming down, and it was all this big sheet thing, whatever it was. And he's in the middle of this. This is like real to him because it's a vision. When you get caught into a vision, it's like, is this real or is this not real? And he was thinking it wasn't real. And so the angel has to basically browbeat him every step of the way. Come on, follow me. And so he followed him out of the cell. Just, let's go. Follows him out of the cell. Verse 10. They went past the first and the second guards and came to the iron gate that would bring them into the city. It opened automatically for them. And they came out and went down one street. Suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, now I know for certain that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people were expecting. So Peter thinks he's in a vision. Oh, look at that guard. Oh, look at that guard. Who knows where he was? I mean, the guards didn't see him. So why didn't the guards see him? And here's, okay, I'm not going to get deep into this simply because of the fact that it's not really the purpose of the message today, but we do know that there are dimensions beyond what we experience. We do know that. There's 10, there's 11 dimensions that we're told by physicists or whatever. Joel could wax more eloquently on this than I can, but I at least am able to say there are 10, maybe 11. We live in 4 of them that we experience. It's length, breadth, height. And with length, breadth, height, there's also duration, which is time passing. So we have 4 of them that we get to experience. And then we get a chance to be able to look into the dimensions that we can interchange or interact with. And probably, this is my theory, that at the fall into sin, those other dimensions were cut off from us. And that's where the spirit realm is at this particular time. And so Peter might have just been zapped into one of those places that we can't see, and yet he could see that place. He could still see where he was, and so he's walking out, and in fact, he obviously can't walk through walls because the walls are still corporeal enough that he has to have the gates and stuff open, but he's just not in a place where the visible realm is happening, where people can see him, and so he's walking by the guards. And of course, the angel's doing something anyway, because if the doors are opening, the guards would see that. And so he's walking out, and he's thinking, wow, this is really amazing. And this is when it gets even more surreal. As they approach this large iron gate to be able to get into the city, it opens by itself. The Greek word is automate, something like that. And that's where we get our word automatic from. So that's why I could translate it automatically. It's like the way the word's supposed to be translated. And it opened automatically for them. And so it did it by itself. And he's probably looking at this going, wow, this is a really bizarre vision. And he steps down. If it was Fortress Antonia, there were 7 steps down to the street that he would have had to go down. In fact, one of the Western, there's a manuscript, the Western, they call it the Western tradition of manuscripts of the New Testament. There's a written thing in it that says he went down the 7 steps. That's like someone who knows. So that's why we believe it was the Fortress Antonia rather than Herod's palace. Because the Western tradition, as they passed this along, they added, he went down the 7 steps. From their mind, there was no doubt where he was being held prisoner. So he goes down the 7 steps and he gets into the city. The last door opens by itself. And then Peter finally realizes, this is real. The cold might have done that to him. This is real. There's no more angel. I've walked about a block and here I am. I'm by myself. Now, by the way, when you come to the realization this is real, what do you think? I better keep going. Because there's going to be a whole lot of shouting about to be happening back there. When they realize I'm no longer there, I'm going to be the most hunted man in all of Jerusalem in, say 10 minutes. And I need to get moving. And so he's thinking, whoa, this is real. It's time for me to go. By the way, this lets us know that Peter had some pretty intense visions. It's really happening to him and he thinks it's a vision. Now that doesn't surprise us when we look at the Apostle John's vision in the book of Revelation. John was, caught up into heaven, and Paul says he was caught up into heaven, the third heaven, and he didn't know if it was in the body or not. I mean, it was just that it was real, but he doesn't know if it was real, or whether it was a vision that he was experiencing. That lets you know that visions can be so real that we think that they are actually happening. And if you get used to visions, there are times that things will really be happening and you're thinking, oh, it's just a vision. That's an interesting thing to contemplate. But Peter realizes, oh my goodness, this is not a vision. I am here. And of course, that suddenly, there was probably a much greater sense of urgency that all of a sudden he was experiencing as he realized, By the way, it makes the next scene even more funny. Because if he's this is his concern. I need to go where I can't be seen. How many Roman guards do you think were roaming the streets of Jerusalem that night? Oh, a lot. Not Herod's guards. They kept the peace overnight. And so what then? And Peter's out there. If you run into someone in the middle of the night, they're going to say, who are you and what are you doing out here at this time of night? And the last thing he wants to have is someone look into his face, because he was well known. So he heads out. It says, when he understood this, meaning that it was real, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. Many people had gathered and were praying there. When he knocked on the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came in response. She recognized Peter's voice and was so joyful that she did not open the door, but ran to report that Peter was standing at the gate, exactly where Peter did not want to be, standing at the gate. He wanted to be inside the courtyard where it was safe. But he was stuck at the gate. Okay, so we are told that this is the home of John Mark's mother. John Mark is the one who wrote the book of Mark, later traveled with the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas was his cousin, and that tells you a little bit about why when Paul and Barnabas had this disagreement about whether they should take John Mark, why Barnabas sided so strongly to John Mark. They were cousins, and so there was family. He says, okay, I'll take him, and Barnabas goes back to Cyprus, his hometown, to be able to evangelize there, and then Paul picks up Silas and heads out into different missionary endeavors. By the way, Mark was reattached throughout his life. We can see that he helped Peter, he helped Paul again, he was reattached to Paul. He was someone that God used in a big way to help everyone. The reason that Mary's house is identified as John Mark's mother is because no one would have known who Mary was, but everyone knew who John Mark was. And so Luke could say, John Mark's place. And everyone would go, oh, okay, I know who that is. So it was John Mark's house. And so Rhoda goes to the door. She doesn't come off real good in this story. She leaves Peter locked outside. Of course, the people inside the house don't all shine in this particular incident. Rhoda's filled with joy. That's really good, but Rhoda did not let him in the door. Maybe she had been trained, that was her job, to go to the gate and see who it was and then bring back the report of who it was and then, go back, if they say, oh, let him in, or, because she's not the one that should be deciding for the most part who's coming in. So she probably just followed her, what she normally did. And she heard it was Peter, she was overjoyed, but she knows, her normal thing is she'd go back and report and they'd let her know. Peter, on the other hand, would like to be inside out of danger. So she runs in and leaves Peter standing at the gate. I can imagine that this story was told over and over and over in the Christian church with a great deal of laughter. Not just because of this, but with what happens next. Because we are told in verses 15, 16, and 17, they said to her, "You're out of your mind." However, she kept on insisting that it was true. They responded, "It's his angel." Meanwhile, Peter kept knocking. Then they opened the door and they saw him and were filled with ecstatic joy. He motioned with his hands for them to be silent and explained to them how the Lord freed him from the prison. He told them, "Tell James and the brothers these things." Then he left them and went to another place. Okay, so we've got Peter, and we've got him knocking at the door. Rhoda goes running back in, says, "Peter's at the door." Now, why are they there? They're praying for Peter, that the Lord would help. But their expectation of what help meant, they were probably asking that Herod's heart would soften, that he'd change the hearts of Herod, whatever. Who knows what they were praying, but they were praying with such passion and authority. The Lord was responding to their prayers, and they just didn't have a vision for it happening that way. And so since they didn't have a vision for it happening that way, she comes running back and says, "Peter's at the door." Now, this is not very kind. But they told her she was out of her mind. Now, that's not polite. And she insisted, so they said, "It's his angel." Now you ask yourself, how many times have they seen angels that they believe it's his angel over Peter? You got to ask yourself this question. It was easier for them to believe that it was Peter's angel than that it was Peter. That's like bizarre. From our perspective, number one, it means that they've seen a lot of angels. Number two, it lets us know that angels can look like the person or at least sound like them. And there's a whole lot going on with that we could plumb. We won't take the time for. But it certainly does let you know that they looked at Rhoda and said, we know right where Peter is. He's in prison. This is not happening. We got the report. He's got soldiers all over him. He's not getting out. And she insisted. Now here's the key. Peter kept knocking. Peter's probably he's going, looking up and down the road, deciding what he was going to do. If I was Peter, I'd have been thinking about jumping the wall. It's like, oh my goodness, if there's any guards that show up, this would be... Now, by the way, Peter at that point in time would not have been freaking out because he had just been let out of prison by an angel. The Lord's going to help him so he can get, where he needs to go. So, anyway, he kept knocking, and so they finally opened the door. By the way, this is not a shining moment of faith. I'm praying for the Lord's intervention. And when he intervenes, you go, nah. This happened once when Josh was a baby. Josh, when he was born, had some issues with his lungs because of the fact that he was premature. He wasn't that premature. We'd seen the Lord's hand already moving. But he had some times where he was attacked by viruses in the first year of his life, and so he'd end up in the hospital under a tent, oxygen. And so when he'd get a fever or something, there were things we couldn't give him because it would impact his breathing. And we didn't want to have to take him, but we knew, his breathing was being impacted. I mean, he turned blue once in the doctor's office, and that was a run to the emergency room. Big run. Doctor was running because he was, of his oxygen levels and stuff like that. So anyway, so we had him at home one time, and he got a fever. And we can't give him the normal medications to bring the fever down. You do the cold bath, you do the stuff like that. And the fever was going up, and I forget what it was, 102, 103 it was up to. And we were at the place where we knew we had to take him to the emergency room. We just were like, and this is what I do. It's 103, it's not coming down. We haven't been able to give him the stuff that normally you'd use to take down because of what it would do to his other things, the unintended consequences. And so we've got one of those ear thermometer things. And I said, Lord, it's 10 minutes to 2 in the morning. Okay, it's just 1:50 a.m. And I said, I really want to believe you, but in 10 minutes I'm taking him to the hospital. I need you to intervene. I took the thermometer and I stuck it in his ear and I pressed it and I looked at it and it said 98.6. And I went, this stupid thing. I am not kidding. And I stuck it in the other ear, and I did it 98.6, and that's when I first realized, oh, it's real. I went, oh, what do? You just go, well, it was 103, now it's 98.6. Okay. Thanks, Lord. Dawn, let's go to bed. Put him to bed. Okay, so whatever. And, we checked him through the night, obviously, because we wanted to keep, because you can do that, and it's like, but I understand them. That's what I'm saying. I'm praying for God's intervention. I had this impassioned plea. I said, Lord, I'm only a human. If you don't move in the next 10 minutes, we have to take him to the hospital. And boom, his temperature goes down to normal. And I'm like, stupid temperature device. That, it wasn't a shining moment of faith for them, but they did get it, and like I said, it's pretty funny. They finally decided, because they could hear the knocking still happening, well, we better check who this is, because Rhoda certainly thinks it's Peter, so we'll go check ourselves. And so they go down and they check the door, and all of a sudden, there's Peter, and boy, they're celebrating. They finally check themselves, and they're like, wow! And it says they were filled with joy in most of your translations, but it's modified. It's that Greek word ecstasy, okay, which is a spiritual experience of joy. It's just not, like drunken joy. This is almost like this is way beyond. There's something that's really spiritual and supernatural. It's like an ecstatic experience verging on that. And it's not a word that always means that, but in certain contexts, especially one like this, it certainly means that. And so they check and they get filled with joy. And of course, guess what people who are filled with joy? And it's a large house. I mean, we know that because it's got a gate and a courtyard. It's a large house. By the way, this is the traditional site of the Last Supper. Upper room, big enough to seat that many people. That might be where they are all right now gathered for their prayer meeting. A lot of people suddenly fill that courtyard. Guess what they're doing? Shouting and yelling. And Peter's going, ah! Don't try. And so it says he's motioning with his hands because he wasn't going to shout above them. He's like probably going, whatever their sign for be quiet was. He's getting them to calm down a little bit. And he's like, I know what he's thinking then. Well, right now the whole neighborhood's awake. I'm out of here. That's because this is no longer a safe place. And it wasn't a safe place anyway because everyone knew about it. And so he told them what happened. And then he says, hey, tell James. And tell the others. And then he left them and went to another place. A place of concealment, of course. His instruction, he says, first, let me tell you what happened. God delivered me. And now you tell James and the others. Isn't that interesting, James? Don't tell John or don't tell one of the other apostles. Tell James. What does it tell you about James? He's already rising up in the structure of the church. And part of the reason is certainly because the apostles were out doing their jobs. Remember, the deacons are gone. Remember Acts 6? Remember when all of a sudden there was a administrative problem in the church that the apostles could not keep on top of because their job was the ministry of the word and prayer? And so they raised up the deacons, and the deacons were doing a great job, but they were all diaspora Jews, Greek-speaking Jews. So when the persecution broke out, guess what happened? They had to leave. So now we're back to the same issue, except there weren't that many Greek-speaking widows anymore either. They had to leave. But you still didn't have the administration in place you needed. And so generally, they would just copy the model of the Jewish church, which was elders, or the Jewish synagogues, which was elders. And James began rising up as an elder. It becomes pretty clear that he was very closely associated with the Pharisee branch of Judaism, which may have been one of the reasons he wouldn't receive Jesus as Messiah right away, because Jesus didn't do Pharisee stuff. And if he was into the Pharisaic end of things, he would not have received Jesus. He just wouldn't have. And until after the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says Jesus appeared to James. Okay, can you imagine that interview? Poor James. Well, no, good thing for James. But Jesus shows up and says, hey, bro, how you doing? I told you. Can you imagine? I told you. Yeah. He was on his knees and on his face, grabbing Jesus' feet by that time. And so James becomes this respected pillar in Jerusalem. Everyone loved James. We're talking everyone, not just the Christians, but the Jewish people. He was considered a pillar. In 62 AD, a new high priest decided, I'm done with this guy. Now remember, the high priests were Sadducees, and he was in favor, James was in favor with the Pharisees. And so he killed him. He just had him killed. And so, publicly charged him and killed him. And it was such a horrendous thing that the Pharisees en masse protested it as a violation of God's law. Later on, just 8 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed. A lot of the Pharisees says that's because James was no longer praying for the church, or praying for the Jerusalem, excuse me. That's how much of when they talk about James, they say his knees were like camel pads, camel feet, hoofs, because of the fact that he was on his knees praying for the city all the time in the temple. So he was highly respected in all of Jerusalem up until the point even that he was killed, and even after he was killed. Some of them ascribed the destruction of Jerusalem to the fact that he had been killed and was no longer praying for the city. So a very interesting man. Anyway, Peter goes, and it says he goes to another place. By the way, he hid himself so well, no one knows where he went. We have our speculation. By the way, there isn't any speculation, even from the early church, where he went. I mean, in the sense of actually having any insight. All they can say is the things, well, we know he ended up in Antioch. We know Paul later on says, Paul said this, don't I have a right to lead around a believing wife like Peter does? Peter did not stay in Jerusalem. That wasn't a safe place for him anymore, or the other apostles. When he shows up in Acts 15 in the council, it's because he shows up for the council and gets out of Dodge. But even then, Herod was dead by then. We'll find out how he died very soon. Next week, week after. Next week's Pentecost. So anyway, he leaves, and he probably just goes out and starts evangelizing everywhere. Ends up in Antioch at some point, we know for sure, because Paul has to say in the book of Galatians he had to confront him there, because there were some people that came from James. Gives you new insight in what it means when people came from James. What was James? A Pharisee. He was a Christian, leading the Jewish church, and one of the reasons he was doing a good job of leading it is because of the fact he was saying, we're still going to be involved in that temple, and that gave him favor with the Jewish authorities. And so it was a time of safety and peace in Jerusalem after that because of James, but because he was so focused on the Jewish rituals, when people from James came up to Antioch, Peter started to, kind of get astray there. Paul had to confront him. So anyway, it's never too late. It's never too late for rescue. That, without a doubt, has to be the main theme that we take from this today. It's never too late for rescue. God can send rescue from any moment. And by the way, the word that we translate salvation or being saved is the same word, which is rescue. A lot of times we look at these scriptures and say, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's nice. And it certainly means spiritual salvation. But it means far more than that. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be rescued, will be delivered. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord and is after him with their whole heart, the Lord is going to intervene in their life every step of the way. There's a reason that Christians who follow the Lord can expect their lives, although they're going to be challenged because Satan hates your guts. And it's good for us to have to overcome things and to grow stronger and become even more of a warrior in this life for the Lord. There is this thing where as we persevere, the Lord shapes us and molds us into the tool he wants to use in his kingdom. And we can always count on the fact he's going to bring his deliverance. It's why when I told you earlier that we got this issue that may add tens of thousands of dollars to our build out, I don't want that to happen. But at the same time, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered. And I know that there's a rescue, there's a deliverance. It may not come the way I expect it to. It may come in a different way. It may come, I don't know, okay? I know for sure if we have to pay it, the resources are going to be there because God knows what he's doing. And I've seen it through this entire process. And by the way, so have you. And so we don't have to fret, but at the same time, we just keep calling on the name of the Lord because we trust somehow the deliverance is going to come. I don't understand. For Peter, he had no idea. He was asleep in the middle of the night, and the angel says, get up and get decent. And Peter's like, what's this? God can do whatever he wants. That was outside of Peter's imagination. And Peter had already had it happen once. And God still sent deliverance at the last moment. So whenever, no matter what it is, you can count on the fact that God is in the deliverance business. He's in the rescue business. And if you are up against something and the rescue doesn't materialize, I am telling you, it was better for you to go through the disappointment and grow in your faith in God anyway, than to see that particular prayer answered. Because sometimes we're asking for rescue, and what we're asking would be the worst thing for us. And we don't know that until later. There's times we go, oh, thank God that didn't happen. 5 years afterwards or whatever. You got to give God the ability to know what's right for us yet. And so I'm expecting deliverance every step of the way. But there are times when I'm expecting rescue, and all of a sudden it doesn't go quite the way I wanted it, and you go, I'm going to learn some lessons from this. And that's how we grow as Christians too. It doesn't stop me from going after rescue. It doesn't stop me from going after deliverance. I've seen too much. But it does remind me that God does need me to be a mature warrior. And he needs you to be that too. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to be able to celebrate your grace in our lives. I ask that you would show us your intervention on every level. Thank you for this rather humorous story of Peter being awakened in the middle of the night to be delivered. I ask that you would give us all the grace we need to be able to grow in you and to see your deliverances. Amen. Okay, thank you to our streamers for being with us today. Before we do what's coming next in this service, we simply wanted to say thanks for being with us. We'll be back Friday night at 7:30 p.m. Hope to see you then. God bless and enjoy your week. Okay, and you...